Hello, welcome back. This is Jeff Byers. This is NE255, and this is Module 10. And I'm going to work with you. This is our first video introduction to nCloth. And so we're going to go ahead and get started right away. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. But a couple things you need to know: that nCloth only works with Polygon meshes. So it won't work with anything else. The higher resolution Polygon meshes create nCloth objects with the higher quality collisions. That is true, but the collisions are very slow, so keep that in mind. And I found a better way than to go with a real high resolution mesh, kind of in between. So I'll take you through that process. And do not use polygon meshes with long, skinny triangles for nCloth. Okay. Do not change the topology of nCloth objects while simulating. Changing the topology will cause it to be a problem, just like it does with rigid bodies. Remember we talked about in the last module that when we change the shape in the middle of a rigid body simulation, it doesn't work. It remembers what it looked like, or what it was scaled at, or what the vertices were at during the simulation. So you basically, if you're going to do that, you have to take the rigid bodies or the nCloth off, make changes, and then add the nCloth back on the object. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, let's get started. So we're going to be working with meters. nCloth works best with meters. So we're going to go ahead and set it up. So go into your preferences and go into working units as meters. Okay, click save, and then what we're going to do here, let me go back into preferences, and I just want to make sure everything's set up right. And then down in the time slider, we want to make sure that we're in dynamics mode, which means that we have the playback speed at play every frame and 24 frames times 1. Click on save, and you can see our grid is much bigger. Okay, so now we're in meters. Alright, so once we're in meter, I need you guys to set up a new project. Okay, I got mine set up as NE255 module 10 cloth simulation. Go ahead and click that and click accept, and that'll make all the folders you need, and then we'll go ahead and start the simulation. Those of you that want to follow along, you sure can, and I recommend it, so you get more and more confident and comfortable with your nCloth instead of just watching the tutorials. Some of you skip over all this preliminary stuff and you're a little lost when you're actually trying to understand what you're doing instead of just following me step by step. So it's best to understand how the cloth actually reacts and why it reacts the way it does to get the best out of this assignment. So let's go ahead and click on a floor plane. We always want that. So I'm going to make it about the size of the grid as we usually do, and just kind of scale that down like that. There we go. Doesn't have to be thick. We're going to lay it right at the top. Okay, like that. And then we're going to create a sphere. Now this is meters now. Try to keep that in mind. I'm going to fit the 4 key. You can see that this is a 3 meters, so that's about a little over 6 feet. I think it's 3.28 if I believe that's correct. 3.28 feet per meter. Okay, so it's a little over 6 feet by 6 feet, so that's a pretty large area. Let's go ahead and move that up to the top like that. Alright, nCloth will work with rigid bodies, okay, but we don't have any rigid bodies. We're going to use a passive. We're going to use something a little bit different this time, so we'll talk about that. And so now we need to think about what I just said about creating an nCloth. Some of the things you have to use polygon meshes. Okay, the higher resolution the polygon mesh is, the better the simulation. That is correct. That's true. But it can really slow you down. So it's got a lot more to simulate. So if we go to mesh, create, and we want to go to plane. Okay, I've got it set up kind of where I want it. Let's talk about this real quick. So 6 by 4, okay? So if you have a rectangle shape, the best thing to do is to get the squares to be exactly perfectly square, and that's kind of what you want, because it says right here, anything elongated triangles. What does that mean? Okay, so elongated triangles would be something like this. If I did 60 here and only 20 there, and if we create that, we have elongated triangles. Let's go ahead and move that up so you can see. So that won't simulate properly. Okay, you'll get a better simulation with the smaller pieces between than the longer ones. So we need to go back in here, and that's why if I do 6 by 4, I usually start it with 30. I divide it in half, basically. So if this was 60, I would divide that in half, so that would give me 30. So it's just 6, and then 40 divided by 2 is 20. So I just kind of did that, and that works out really good. You can see that we get the right square count that we need. And usually when I'm simulating, because simulation does take a lot longer than you think, put it up just above the sphere. You can get it pretty close before you simulate. If you raise it too high, you're just going to be waiting forever to fall, because what it does is it just falls down. Okay, so let's go ahead and just a little bit above. Okay, and that works out great. Now I could easily duplicate this, Control D that. Now that deletes the history. Now whenever you copy something, it deletes that history for that object. Now notice I can go back in here and change this. So the resolution, I could definitely bring that up. Okay, I could say I could do twice the resolution, or 3 times. So let's say this is 120. Okay, right. So it was, let's go 60 instead. Let's go double. So it was 30 before, now it's 60, and it's double this one to 40. Okay, so that's double the resolution of this one over here. Okay, so let me click on the wireframe so you guys can get a better look. Now obviously, which one do you think will simulate better? I mean, give you the most wrinkles and the most beautiful draping? It's going to be the higher resolution, but it's also going to take forever for it to simulate. Now, if you're kind of on a schedule, you're going to want to probably start the simulation with this first to get the cloth to see how it's going to. It's kind of like rendering, where you don't render right off the bat the highest resolution because you're just messing around with the lights and getting the lights just right. That's a waste of time. Same thing can be said about this. It's kind of a waste of time to have a high resolution mesh. You could do that at the very end. Okay, right? So anyway, what I would recommend is we start with something like this, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to hide this, okay, and that'll be kind of our high resolution. But I'm going to kind of give you some tips on this real quick, and we'll come back to this high res in just a moment. Let's go ahead and click on that and get rid of that for a second. So we're going to just mess with this guy. So this was the lower resolution one. So if you didn't catch that, you can go to Create, Polygon, and then Plane, and then these are the settings that I had originally. No, that's not right. This should be 30. So originally settings as 6 by 4, 30 by 20, and that's what it'll give you, that grid. Okay. Alright, so with that said, now we're ready for our simulation. So it's good to go in here and go to File, Save Scene As, and I've already done this. Just type in something like Introduction to Cloth Start 01 and Save As. Okay, so this is your setup, and what I want to do is I want to select everything and delete by type history. Just go ahead and center pivot everything, delete by type, and freeze transformations. Just a good thing to do, and you notice I do that all the time. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and instead of just adding passive rigid body, we're going to go into nCloth and go to passive collider. Okay? And I'm going to go ahead and select the ball and do the same thing. I'm going to go to nCloth, create passive collider. Okay, and then the cloth itself will be, you guessed it, nCloth, create nCloth. And I can go into the option box and I can go ahead and reset. There's not much here, and click on create cloth. There we go. So like nParticles, it has the same kind of attributes. It's got self-collide, it's got static friction, and some other things like that. In fact, nCloth is there's a lot more involved with nCloth, even more so than the liquids, the nCloth liquids. So we're going to go through those slowly. I might not hit every single one, but we'll definitely hit most of them. Alright, so what do we got next? The first one is the collision attributes, I believe. Let's go ahead and hit the simulation and see what happens with the default settings. I think I'm going to have the default settings. Yeah, it looks like. Okay, so first of all, we don't have a near enough. With this type of simulation, we're going to need around 1200 frames. Let's go ahead and type in 1200 frames. There we go. And let's go ahead and do our simulation. Now this is like paint drying again. I'm sorry, it's just this is how simulation is, and unfortunately I'm not going to pause it. We're going to let this play out as long as I want, and that's enough. So you can see this looks like a really stiff piece of burlap, or even a thin piece of metal. Okay, it's not looking like fabric at all. Okay, so they don't really give you a really good default setting for a cloth. It's not like they give you a wonderful setting, but there are some presets, which is really cool. But I want to take you through the settings first before we start messing with presets. Okay, so let's take you through what makes this thing tick. Alright, so when you open this up, it'll look something like this. Okay, so when you click on the cloth, okay, you're going to want to make sure that you are let's see here, output, there it is. Nope. nCloth. There we go. nCloth shape. That's it. So nCloth shape is where we need this to be. So nCloth shape. And what we're going to do here is go open up collisions. So we have, you can turn off collisions altogether. You can have the collisions, you can turn off the collide, okay, for it with objects, or just have it collide for itself, or you can turn off both and it will act just like that's not cloth anymore. Okay, so you want both of those on. And collision flag face, basically it collides, and I would highly recommend face. You can click on vertex to play with it a little bit in edge. They don't work as well as face. That's the collision between the passive rigid body and the nCloth, or the passive nCloth and the nCloth itself. The passive's underneath here, and you can see it kind of poking through. Even when I get up close, it's poking through a little bit. We'll address that in just a little bit. But the idea here is that you can change that. You can go to vertex. Let's go ahead and do a simulation. And it has a harder time. So it starts pulling through and ripping. Okay, so that's no good. It's slow, but it does finally rip and shear. Edge, the same kind of thing, except not as bad. Okay, but it still shears at the very last moment, meaning that it will still shear. And then we've got the face, which is the best. Okay, and you can play around with these, but I just found that face and vertex face gives you the best. Collision strength, it kind of acts like this when I go to vertex. The lower I go, the less strength it has. So if I go all the way down to collide strength, it just doesn't see the object at all. It goes right through it. Okay, the highest we can go is 1, so it's set at the right level. I'm not sure why you would use this. You might find a reason to make it so it does shear and go through a little bit. You know, it's entirely up to you what you're looking for. But normally you would just keep it at 1. Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at is the collision. Okay. So when we look at collision, the collision layer, excuse me, this assigns the current nCloth object to a specific collision layer. Now we're not worried about this because right now the collision layer we're set at is just at 0. Both of these, this is probably set at 0 and this is probably set at 1. And so those are we can layer this out, and it works better with clothing. So if you have layers of clothing, this really comes in handy. And when we get into the clothing, we'll discuss that a little bit more. But right now, it really doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing, so keep it at 0. Okay. Thickness. Now that has to do with some of the collision issues we're having on top. Okay. So right now the thickness is at 0.035. All right. Just not quite enough. When you get close, usually that disappears. Okay. And you'll never see that. Hopefully you don't in your renders, and if you do, you're definitely going to have to go in there and fix that. But we'll fix it anyway. So how do we see that? Well, it's under solver display. We can go to collision thickness. Now you can see that's very, very thin. Okay. So I found that to get rid of that entirely, that collision that we see there, is to bring that up quite a bit. We can do it like to 0.5. Again, this will slow you down a little bit with your collision. Alright, so be careful how far you go with that. But it will help. Let's go back to off. It will help when you get closer that it does fix the issue. You can see that it is no longer, you can't see it. And we're at 0.5. What you want to do is you kind of want to play with it until you get just the right spot, okay, for that type of collision where it doesn't show through. Okay. Alright, so we still see it. So, you know, I think I had it pretty good at 0.5, so we'll leave it at 0.5. Alright. Let's go back. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to move down to self-collide with scale. Again, that's something that, as far as the self-collide with scale, specifies the self-collision scale value for the current nCloth object. So right now we have it set at 1, and if you were to set that lower than, or excuse me, lower than that, then the self-collide, the self-collision width scale, it would interpenetrate each other. So if something like, let's say the corners of these this blanket touch each other, they'll cross into each other. You don't want that, so we want to keep that up at 1. Let's go ahead and just keep that at 1. And the 1 scale basically allows it to see each other, and they will hit each other on the outside. Okay, so, and they shouldn't interpenetrate. But sometimes you see that, so you'll have to raise that up a little bit. Okay. Okay, solver display we've already talked about. Solver display color, that's like when we go into thickness and then we change the color of this, whatever we want. Okay, we'll just keep it as is. Bounce is what it means. It's bounce basically gives you, it's the bounciness or the stretchiness of the object, or the springiness, I should say, not stretchiness, but springiness. So it's got some spring to it, kind of like what's a good cloth that stretches? Spandex. That would be a good one. So it'd give you kind of a spandexy, kind of springy feeling to it. So you can kind of play with that. And I usually set mine to 0.1 just as a default. And friction, I keep it between 0.1 and 0.2. I'm going to go to 0.2 on here. Okay. To start with. Stickiness, I want to go to 0.1. Everything has a little bit of stickiness. The stickiness and friction kind of work together. But I don't want to go too high. You could go between 0.05 and 0.1. You always you want a little bit to it, because you don't want it sliding off your objects all the time, right? That's one of the big things. Okay. Alright, and dynamic properties. We're not going to get into collision property maps, but this is the next one that's really good. So stretch resistance. It specifies the amount the current nCloth object resists stretching when under tension. Okay, the higher it is, the less stretchy, and this is the problem we're having with it. We don't have enough stretch in it. So we're going to go ahead and set that lower. Okay, so we're going to go to 5. Okay, there we go. Compression resistance, again, is set way too high, because the higher you go, the less the less or the higher compression it will take to push down on that object, the gravity. So it's going to seem stiff. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that down. So again, if I go down to 0, it's going to feel like rubber bands. Now it won't do that because we still have some bend resistance and stuff that we got to deal with. Okay, so we're just going to set that one to something like 2 or something like that. So it went from 10 to 2. Bend resistance. Alright, specifies the amount of the nCloth object resists bending across edges and under the strain. So this is kind of a problem. Usually something this high. Let's go to point 0.01 on that. That will help a lot. And you can even drop it down to 0 if you want to. Okay. Alright, so bend drop off, it's set to 0. And that's a harder one to understand because it works with the bend resistance together, those two together. So the higher you go, the drop off will go lower. Bend angle drop off. So I'm going to keep those at 1, or excuse me, at 0. And if you go all the way up to 1, you're going to have the highest bend angle. So you can kind of play with that. But I usually keep it at 0 to look more like cloth. Shear resistance specifies the amount the current nCloth object resists shearing. Now this is what we're talking about. It was shearing through the top, but a lot of that had to do with the thickness. So if you see that, if you can get that worked out with this shear resistance, but that also makes it stiffer. Okay, so you kind of have to work between the shear resistance and the thickness, okay, of the object. Right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the top and let's turn this off, okay, so we can see the mesh. And now let's go ahead and I want you to type in these attributes. So collide strength at 1, collision layer at 0, thickness at 1. We had made a change there. Self collide scale width scale to 1. Solver display off. Bounce at 1.1. Friction at 0.1. Stickiness at 0. Stretch resistance at 2. Compression resistance at 1. Bend resistance at 0.001. Bend angle drop off at 0.5. Shear resistance at 0.5. Angle restitution angle at 360. Restitution tension at 1000. Everything else is set the same. Okay, it's just defaulted. Alright, let's go ahead and play the simulation. This will be the last time that we play the simulation, and I'm going to talk to you about how to set the initial state. So let's say we do a simulation and we want to start the animation at a certain point of the simulation. So whichever point you want to start simulating at, you stop it. I think we're about really close to that. So I'm going to stop it. And let me type in 1200. I had that before. That worked out pretty good. So about right there. Now it hasn't really rested on the ground yet, as you can see. So I'm going to go ahead and continue the simulation until I feel that it is resting on the ground. It is twirling, and that's normal for cloth when it has movement in it. Okay, you can see I'm about right where it is touching the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and click stop. Okay, so this is a good point, a place to stop the simulation and set initial state. Okay, it doesn't look like it's gonna. It just looks like it's moving around now. Let's go ahead and go to fields and solvers. Go to initial state, set for selected. Okay, now it'll set the initial state. Now don't do this, and I would recommend that you save your work if you think you're going to change your mind on this. So I would always save your work before you do set initial state. Okay, because I don't know if a Control Z will let you go back. It might let you go back, but what if you go too far with it and you can't go back? So then you'll have to start simulating again. But this is the nice thing about this, is that I can bring it back to 1, and now we can play the animation, simulate, and you can take that simulation from this point, okay, which is great because it works really well with clothing. So you go ahead and do the simulation, let's say a skirt that's falling down, and you get it to where you want it to be, and then you set the initial state, and then you can have the character walking then at that point because it's already set it to its initial state. So it's a great thing to have, and I wanted to show you that. The next thing you can do with this is you can use this as a modeling tool. Okay, let's say I go ahead and create a simulation, and now I don't want the simulation on anymore. Okay, but I want to keep the simulation, so I'm going to show you a way to do that. So do a Control A and select the cloth and do a Control D, which is a duplicate, and then click on a new layer, add new object. So I can turn that off, and I still have my simulation, right? So I'm going to click on that. So let's go ahead and rename this one. So let's call this Polygon Mesh. Okay, and this one is nCloth. Okay. Alright. And the ball is just a ball. Alright, so get all that named and in. Okay, great. So now we can go and turn everything off, and we've got our Polygon Mesh. So with this, there is no longer, dynamic simulation on it, so we don't have to worry about it. It's not sliding around either, but it's got conformed. So that's a great modeling tool, and you can think of all the cool things you can do with that, with adding cloth, because it'd be hard to sculpt all those folds in. And the nice thing about this is that I don't have to be happy with the low poly. I can go in there and really make it look nice. So let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to duplicate the Polygon Mesh, Control D, and add it to a new layer. Turn off the low poly, and this is going to be high poly. So let's call this high mesh. Okay. So save that, and then we can go in here to mesh and smooth it at 2. So now we've got a great smooth object. And let's go ahead and delete by type history here. Okay. And so I can get rid of the wireframe unshaded, so you can see how nice and smooth it is. It looks really good. And then at this point, you can either use ZBrush, bring it into ZBrush, export it into ZBrush, and continue, messing with it. You see, you have a really great start to it. Or you can use the tools in Maya if you don't have ZBrush. So you can go into Mesh Tools and go into Sculpting Tools and go into Sculpt Tool. And I've got mine set at a pretty low rate here. Let's go up a little bit smaller. Let's go to something like 0.15. Okay, so I can go and sculpt and strength at, let's see how strong that is right now. Okay, it's pulling out. Okay, let's push in by holding the Control key and push that in. And just accentuate that a little more right there. A little bit more right in through here. Okay. And there might be some underfold in here that we want to accentuate. Push a little bit harder. And maybe one right through here. Maybe one right in through here. Pushing that a little bit more. Okay. Again, the Maya sculpting tools aren't anything like ZBrush, so don't expect that they will be. But they do a pretty good job. You can do some really cool things in here. Now, if you don't like what you've done, you can always use the Smooth tool and start with 100 or something around there, and you can see that smoothing things out a little bit better. There we go. That looks better. Okay, so basically that's it. That's you've got a model now that would have taken you, it'd be impossible to do actually. I wouldn't say impossible. Okay, hit the Q key to get out of sculpting, but it makes it a lot easier. So if you had a scene, an outdoor scene, and you had some paint cans and you wanted a piece of cloth over top of the paint cans or hanging over that, do nCloth and then create a model from it. So that's basically it for the introduction. That's everything I wanted to kind of go through with cloth, got you started, and then we'll take you through the presets. We'll go through the presets when we actually do our assignment. Alright, I'll see you guys in the first assignment. I believe it's adding a drape over a cadaver, which will be fun. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next video.